Hello, New Prospect, and welcome to RTB 2021. This is for January 8th, and our text for today are four. Once again, there's going to be, I think, in coming days, we're going to have some that actually have more chapters to read, but for today, it's just chapter 8 for January 8th for Ezra, Genesis, Matthew, and Acts once again. So once again, I just want to kind of briefly go through the different texts and make a few comments about them, and then focus in on one specific one. The first one we can look at is, let's go all the way over to Acts. And here in Acts, we find, if you remember all the way back in Acts 1, there's the commission that Jesus gives to his disciples to go and be his witnesses to Jerusalem, to Judea, to Samaria, and to the othermost parts of the earth. And here you see that kind of progression where the gospel is going forward to those outer reaches of it's expanding. It's going forth to all the nations. And here we see it beginning to move into Samaria with the ministry of Philip. Then we have Philip being transported in one of my favorite stories in the book of Acts, which is the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. This eunuch just is riding along, minding his own business, reading through the book of Isaiah, and all of a sudden, Philip appears to him. Philip asks him if he understands what he's reading. The eunuch says, "Well, how can I if I don't have anybody to explain it to him?" And it just so happens that the passage he's reading is from Isaiah 53. Probably, I think it's the second most quoted passage from the Old Testament and the New Testament. Isaiah 53, the famous song of the suffering servant. And that song, of course, speaks of a servant, a messianic character, a Davidic king who would suffer on behalf of his people, who would, by his stripes, heal his people, who would, though his people were like sheep who have gone astray, each of them had turned to their own way, the Lord caused the iniquity of us all to fall upon him. And so here we have this eunuch reading through that scripture, and Philip gets up and explains how it is all the scripture, and really all the scripture of the Old Testament, is fulfilled in Jesus. And the eunuch says, "What does prohibit me from being baptized?" This is one of those texts. It's a great text for many reasons. Isaiah 53 is. But it's one of those texts that if you talk to Jews who have accepted Jesus as Messiah, this is one of those texts that they will point to and say, "I cannot explain this text in any other way than Jesus being fulfilled specifically in him." It was a text written some 700 years before the time of Christ, fulfilled specifically in Jesus. It's almost like you're reading a text of scripture that was written by Paul, and yet it was written some 700 years before Jesus. In the book of Matthew and Ezra and Genesis, we have, I think, three stories that somewhat are similar in theme. In the book of Genesis, we have the story of Noah, continuing the story of Noah, and God is bringing the flood to an end, makes a covenant with Noah. In Ezra, we have the story of how Ezra is leading a group of people back to the promised land, and he is a group of mainly priests back to the promised land. Now, just in context there, you remember that Cyrus, king of Persia, had allowed the Jewish people to return home in 539 BC. Ezra is not coming back until about 458 BC. So we're talking about around 80 years after the initial return from exile that Ezra is leading this group of people back from Babylon to the promised land. And in this text, Ezra is concerned for the safety of the people as they go across this very forbidding region, not just environmentally, but also enemies, people who might attack their group as they wander over the desert back to the promised land, to Jerusalem. And so he consecrates a fast to ask for God's protection. They don't want to ask the Persians for protection because they've told the Persians that God will protect them. And so the good hand of the Lord will be upon them. And so they ask God for protection. And then in Matthew 8, we have several stories involving Jesus and some of his healings and miracles. Of course, in the Gospels, these healings and miracles are often serving not just to help us to understand something of the authority of Jesus's message, but also to help us to understand something of the person of Jesus. And one of the most famous of these miracles is the calming of the storm. Each of these stories, from Matthew 8, from Ezra 8, and from Genesis 8, we find stories that reiterate God's protection, I think, over his people. In Genesis 8, of course, we have God's protection and covenant with Noah. In Ezra, God's protection with his covenant people, led by Ezra as they go back to the promised land. And then in Matthew 8, Jesus's protection over his covenant people, his new covenant people, represented by the disciples in this storm. And so I think there's an interesting theme that unites these stories. And one final thing, let me state about the Genesis passage. The Genesis story of Noah is a complex one. It seems to skip around at times, and it has some interesting structural points. But the way it's structured, it's almost a mirror-like structure, what scholars would call a chiasm, where we have the beginning and the ending corresponding, then the second element corresponding to the second to last element, and so on and so forth. It's a very common way for a Hebrew to tell a story, or even to in poetic devices, in poems as well. It's a common poetic device. And oftentimes what you find in the center of that chiasm, as you get narrowed down to the middle of it, is going to be the theme of whatever that story or poem is. In this case, if you go to the center of the chiasm in Genesis 6 through 9, the story of Noah, you find Genesis 8:1, God remembered Noah. And that word for remembering is a really key word in biblical text. It's a word that speaks of, it's not God forgetting his people. It's not like, oh, I forgot it, now I remember it. No, when it speaks of remembering, and anytime you encounter that word in the biblical text, oftentimes, especially as it regards God, because God doesn't forget, what he's doing is he's calling something to mind in order to act on it. In this case, he's calling to mind the promises he made to Noah in order to act on them. We see that word remembering occurring throughout the rest of Scripture. You'll see it a lot in the Psalms, for instance. The psalmist will talk about, God, remember me in my suffering. Well, he's not asking God to, you forgot about me, you need to remember me. What he's saying is, God, call to mind your promises, your goodness, your character. Call these things to mind so that you might act on them. And probably the best example of this is in the Gospel of Luke. And I'll read this to you real quick. I know we're running short of time here, but in Zechariah's prophecy in Luke 1, he speaks of, if I can remember it, in verse 72 of Luke 1, where Zechariah is speaking of how God is about to act through his Messiah, that Luke is going to tell them about throughout the rest of this Gospel of Luke. And he says, remember your holy covenant. Well, again, God hasn't forgotten his covenant, but he's going to call it to mind in order to act on it. And so this is a good, I think thing to meditate on today, that God protects his people, but also God remembers. And it's not him remembering because he's forgotten something. He remembers us in our state of sin, ultimately, to act on his promises in order to deliver us through the work of his suffering servant, Jesus Christ, to bring us salvation. So I hope that's an encouraging thought for you today as you begin this day, January 8th, 2021.